heft and nutritional value in the case of the potato-eating human. The fact that one of us has evolved to become intermittently aware of its desires makes no difference whatsoever to the flower or the potato taking part in this arrangement. All those plants care about is what every being cares about on the most basic genetic level: making more copies of itself. Through trial and error, these plant species have found that the best way to do that is to induce animals, bees or people, it hardly matters, to spread their genes. How? By playing on the animal's desires, conscious and otherwise. The flowers and spuds that manage to do this most effectively are the ones that get to be fruitful and multiply. So the question arose in my mind that day: did I choose to plant these potatoes, or did the potato make me do it? In fact, both statements are true. I can remember the exact moment that spud seduced me, showing off its knobby charms in the pages of a seed catalog. I think it was the tasty-sounding, buttery yellow flesh that did it. This was a trivial, semi-conscious event. It never occurred to me that our catalog encounter was of any evolutionary consequence whatsoever. Yet evolution consists of an infinitude of trivial, unconscious events, and in the evolution of the potato, my reading of a particular seed catalog on a particular January evening counts as one of them. That May afternoon, the garden suddenly appeared before me in a whole new light. The manifold delights it offered to the eye and nose and tongue no longer quite so innocent or passive. All these plants, which I'd always regarded as the objects of my desire, were also, I realized, subjects, acting on me, getting me to do things for them they couldn't do for themselves. And that's when I had the idea. What would happen if we looked at the world beyond the garden this way, regarded our place in nature from the same upside-down perspective? This book attempts to do just that, by telling the story of 4 familiar plants: the apple, the tulip, cannabis, and the potato, and the human desires that link their destinies to our own. Its broader subject is the complex reciprocal relationship between the human and natural world, which I approach from a somewhat unconventional angle. I take seriously the plant's point of view. The 4 plants whose stories this book tells are what we call domesticated species, a rather one-sided term, that grammar again, that leaves the erroneous impression that we're in charge. We automatically think of domestication as something we do to other species, but it makes just as much sense to think of it as something certain plants and animals have done to us, a clever evolutionary strategy for advancing their own interests. The species that have spent the last 10,000 or so years figuring out how best to feed, heal, clothe, intoxicate, and otherwise delight us have made themselves some of nature's greatest success stories. The surprising thing is, we don't ordinarily regard species like the cow and the potato, the tulip and the dog as nature's more extraordinary creatures. Domesticated species don't command our respect the way their wild cousins often do. Evolution may reward interdependence, but our thinking selves continue to prize self-reliance. The wolf is somehow more impressive to us than the dog. Yet there are 50 million dogs in America today, only 10,000 wolves. So what does the dog know about getting along in this world that its wild ancestor doesn't? The big thing the dog knows about, the subject it has mastered in the 10,000 years it has been evolving at our side, is us, our needs and desires, our emotions and values, all of which it has folded into its genes as part of a sophisticated strategy for survival. If you could read the genome of the dog like a book, you would learn a great deal about who we are and what makes us tick. We don't ordinarily give plants as much credit as animals, but the same would be true of the genetic books of the apple, the tulip, cannabis, and the potato. We could read volumes about ourselves in their pages, in the ingenious sets of instructions they've developed for turning people into bees. After 10,000 years of coevolution, their genes are rich archives of cultural as well as natural information. The DNA of that tulip there, the ivory one with the petals attenuated like sabers, contains detailed instructions on how best to catch the eye, not of a bee, but of an Ottoman Turk. It has something to tell us about that age's idea of beauty. Likewise, every russet Burbank potato holds within it a treatise about our industrial food chain and our taste for long, perfectly golden French fries. That's because we have spent the last few thousand years remaking these species through artificial selection, transforming a tiny, toxic root node into a fat, nourishing potato and a short, unprepossessing wildflower into a tall, ravishing tulip. What is much less obvious, at least to us, is that these plants have, at the same time, been going about the business of remaking us. I call this book The Botany of Desire because it is as much about the human desires that connect us to these plants as it is about the plants themselves. My premise is that these human desires form a part of natural history in the same way the hummingbird's love of red does, or the ant's taste for the aphid's honeydew. I think of them as the human equivalent of nectar. So, while the book explores the social history of these plants, weaving them into our story, it is at the same time a natural history of the 4 human desires these plants evolved to stir and gratify. I'm interested not only in how the potato altered the course of European history, or how cannabis helped fire the Romantic Revolution in the West, but also in the way notions in the minds of men and women transformed the appearance, taste, and mental effects of these plants. Through the process of coevolution, human ideas find their way into natural facts. The contours of a tulip's petals, say, or the precise tang of a Jonagold apple. The 4 desires I explore here are sweetness, broadly defined in the story of the apple, beauty in the tulips, intoxication in the story of cannabis, and control in the story of the potato. Specifically, in the story of a genetically altered potato I grew in my garden to see where the ancient arts of domestication may now be headed. These 4 plants have something important to teach us about these 4 desires. That is, about what makes us tick. For instance, I don't think we can begin to understand beauty's gravitational pull without first understanding the flower, since it was the flower that first ushered the idea of beauty into the world the moment long ago when floral attraction emerged as an evolutionary strategy. By the same token, intoxication is a human desire we might never have cultivated had it not been for a handful of plants that managed to manufacture chemicals with the precise molecular key needed to unlock the mechanisms in our brain governing pleasure, memory, and maybe even transcendence. Domestication is about a whole lot more than fat tubers and docile sheep. The offspring of the ancient marriage of plants and people are far stranger and more marvelous than we realize. There is a natural history of the human imagination, of beauty, religion, and possibly philosophy too. One of my aims in this book is to shed some light on the part in that history these ordinary plants have played. Plants are so unlike people that it's very difficult for us to appreciate fully their complexity and sophistication. Yet plants have been evolving much, much longer than we have been inventing new strategies for survival and perfecting their designs for so long that to say that one of us is the more advanced really depends on how you define that term, on what advances you value. Naturally, we value abilities such as consciousness, tool-making, and language, if only because these have been the destinations of our own evolutionary journey thus far. Plants have traveled all that distance and then some. They've just traveled in a different direction. Plants are nature's alchemists, expert at transforming water, soil, and sunlight into an array of precious substances, many of them beyond the ability of human beings to conceive, much less manufacture. While we were nailing down consciousness and learning to walk on 2 feet, They were, by the same process of natural selection, inventing photosynthesis. The